Let's look at the governor's proposed budget through the eyes of one of the state's leading businessmen, next on Behind the Headlines.
This is Behind the Headlines, with behind-the-scenes analysis on issues affecting Pennsylvanians, sponsored by the Susquehanna Valley Center for Public Policy. Now, here's your host.
Hi, welcome to a new edition of Behind the Headlines. I'm Charlie Greenewald, Senior Fellow of the Susquehanna Valley Center for Public Policy. And in this particular show, my guest is Ed Arnold. Mr. Arnold is, of course, the president of Susquehanna Valley Center for Public Policy. Ed, welcome to the show.
Good to see you, Charlie.
It's nice to have you back.
Yes.
And, of course, what the main topic of discussion is in state government at this point is, of course, the governor's proposed budget. And I'd like to pick your brain for the first half of the show about the budget. In the second half of the show, we'd like to have a new installment of the Arnold Report where we will pose our viewers questions to you about finances and financial advice. But this state budget that Governor Corbett has released a little while ago, what does it look like to you? Good, bad? What are the high points and low points?
Well, obviously, in all things, there's always good and there's bad. The overall thing is they are continuing to honor their pledge of getting government spending under control.
Mm-hmm. For the second year in a row.
For the second year in a row, that obviously government spending has gone up a very small amount. Actually, overall, it's going down because they have to make up for all the federal money that's not coming in. That is a very positive. The thing that I would consider a negative is it's still smart spending. And what I mean by smart spending, the areas they've chosen to reduce, are they the least effective part of the monies we're spending in the government? In this case, they're on education and some other areas like this. I really would challenge one of the areas is government employees. The state has, I believe it's 75,000 employees. There's a tremendous amount of people in the state that are not getting any increases at all. Yet the state is going to give a 1% overall increase and a 2.3 or 2.5 in grade increase. Well, why? We already know that the state employees cost more, but even more so, the state's benefits are literally at least double compared to the private world. I noticed that their actuarial thing of what the cost of the state health plan after retirement, we cannot afford a state health plan after retirement. That's what General Motors had. That's why one of the reasons they went bankrupt. Therefore, the solution to that would be to slowly evolve, having the state employees have a plan A and a plan B. The plan A, which is the present plan, you would pay substantially towards, but there would be a more reasonable plan that you would probably still pay very little towards. This would steer the employees to become more efficient in their use of health care. Similar situation in their pension. The other smart area is what I would call the yield of our taxes. If we were to look right now at what does it cost to collect a tax and how fair is the tax. Pennsylvania right now has extremely high business taxes. And that is, we have a capital stock tax and we have an income tax. Most states do not have a capital stock tax, and Pennsylvania is one of the highest income tax.
Even though the capital stock and franchise tax is being phased out over time.
It's being phased, which makes it the least cost effective, because whatever the cost to collect it was, if you reduce the revenue you collect in half, obviously the cost of collection as a percentage is going to double.
But you agree it's a good thing to phase it out?
I think we should not phase it out. We should eliminate it.
Okay.
And it's very easy. We'll tax the business community exactly the same as we're taxing them now. I am completely confused by this idea that we should not or should limit our tax on Marcellus Shale. Fact, West Virginia has a tax that, if we pass the one we're proposing, will be sometime where approximately 3 times higher than the tax we're proposing. Presently, we have none at all.
So you're saying West Virginia's tax on Marcellus Shale is 3 times higher than our impact fee will be.
And they have had drilled more wells this year and the most successful drilling program in the country. So obviously the drilling industry sees the profits to be made even if there is a relatively substantial tax. Mm-hmm. Why doesn't Pennsylvania therefore mimic the Marcellus Shale tax, which would bring in a substantial hundreds of millions of dollars, And probably with that money, you could eliminate the capital stock tax and have no effect on the overall thing, because now you would eliminate this giant department, capital stock department. So basically, we're not going to tax business more. We're going to take it from one area that can, obviously West Virginia's shown us, and so has Texas, and so have all the other states. Other states do have taxes substantially higher than we're proposing. We have none now. We will have one of the lowest of anybody.
Okay.
It makes no sense. So again, smart tax. And what would we do with this money from Marcellus? Well, we do two things. Number one, we make sure it is a safe, intelligent industry. We'd have proper regulation, proper, smart regulation. The other thing, we would help to make sure that there is money filtered back to the local governments for their infrastructure and the cost that is being incurred because of this, not just the jobs it's creating.
And that's good and reasonable.
That's right. And the remainder then, because there's going to be a remainder, a substantial remainder, would go to the state coffers to eliminate the capital stock tax. We keep talking about we want to have growth. The number one impediment to business growth, even more possibly than taxes, is the tax of regulation. Mm-hmm. America overall, in fact, the latest copy of Economist has, the death of America because of regulation.
Because of over-regulation, right.
And we continue. We
Yes.
seem to have this thing that we never rescind the law. We only add new ones. Well, I am sure Pennsylvania is similar, and therefore it's a win-win scenario. There's a double cost to regulations. The government must pay people to regulate and to enforce the laws, assuming they do it fairly. And, of course, the tax on business by having to prepare all these items is tremendous. Mm-hmm. So, therefore, we need cost effect. We need regulation. This idea that we want to deregulate everything, no. We've got to have intelligent regulation, and we definitely have to seriously look at, and I don't think we have a law in Pennsylvania at all, what is the cost of a regulation on the industry, on the government to enforce it, and is it really being enforced intelligently? Mm-hmm. The example, which is the federal government right now, this new Frank Dodd bill, is a disaster. They said it'll take 10 years to finally do all the regulations, just to show how our government is. And again, I can only talk about the federal because it's the article I read. When we had a banking crisis in 1890, there was a 12-page law passed to straighten things out. When we had the major problem in the Depression, which was obviously in the mid-30s, they finally passed another banking regulation. It was 37 pages. This new regulation just passed is 1,000 pages or close to it, and they feel with all the sub-regulations that will come out of it, it will be maybe 10,000 pages. It is absolutely ridiculous. Nobody will ever understand it. Mm-hmm. This is regulation out of control. Mm-hmm. So therefore, I've not seen anything in our budget is talking about how can we be smarter. That's what our government has to do. We need a good, efficient government. They have a role to serve, but let's not just pass laws with disregard to their cost.
Okay. Let's get into different areas of the budget itself, Ed. For example, the biggest part of the budget, of course, continues to be welfare. What does that part of the budget look like to you?
Well,
we're going in the right direction, wrong direction?
It doesn't appear to be doing what it should be doing, but I would like to spend another section on that alone because it's too big. The same with education. I realize these two big items, which I don't know if everybody realizes, but between them, they are $21 billion out of our $27 to $28 billion budget. However, because they're so important...
That's welfare and education.
And education. We'd like to talk about those separately. What I would like to talk about is an area where we are improving, which is our state penal system and our whole legal.
Okay, corrections is another big area. Yes.
It is the third biggest item. True, it's only somewhat north of $1 billion when I say only, but it's an area where other states we could learn from. We are doing things to improve. We are making a better parole system. We are trying to guide people, but it appears that we aren't doing nearly as much as an example in Hawaii, because the number one cause of people in jail is drugs. Overwhelming. According to what I was told by the warden in Rikers Island in New York City, over 70% of the people are involved in drugs that are in their prison system. I assume we're not that much different in Pennsylvania. And therefore, what has Hawaii done? They have a system where you are released early, but you must call in every day, and they will random test you when they decide.
Yeah, I believe that it's called the HOPE system, and I believe they call you every day, and then they tell you.
Oh, they call you. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. That's all right. There's so many different programs.
Yeah.
They call you every day, and then they tell you whether or not you're going to be drug tested that day or not. And you
tremendously
never know
reduced
from day to day.
the number of people using drugs. It is a very successful system.
70% reduction.
That is tremendous. Pennsylvania is showing some reductions, but nothing in like that. Texas has a system where, again, an early release program, and they give you tremendous support. They have their own drug rehab program. If you stay clean for a year, your sentence is commuted. It's eliminated.
That's Texas.
And again, they've had a tremendous reduction.
Now, is that for nonviolent
yes,
offenders?
Of course. This is only
Okay.
drugs and nonviolent, and this is drug users, not the pushers. Michigan is covering a variety of things, but basically, again, shorter time in jail, but more supervision and control outside the jail. Again, helping people to assimilate back into society, helping with housing, helping find a job training. There's a lot of different areas, and use electronics. Whereas right now we have the simple thing of the electronic bracelet or other ways to have a semi-house arrest. You can control where the person is. This is an inconvenience, but it's at 1/10 or lower cost than it is to have a man in prison, and he's assimilating into the real world while you're controlling. Again, there seems to be a lot of states are doing a lot of things. It would appear that we're moving in the direction, but not as fast as we should, and not as aggressively as other states.
Okay. You want to go back now to talk about welfare?
No, actually, I'd like
I'm
to talk
sorry.
about transportation.
Oh, okay.
That right now, our transportation in Pennsylvania, we know is challenged. We know we have a tremendous amount of deferred maintenance.
And of course, the governor on transportation said this is an area of the budget that is so daunting, it's so big, the challenge is so big that it needs to be talked about separately at a future date with the legislators. And it's sort of been left hanging, Ed.
And the problem is the roads are not going to just stay frozen while we don't bother to address the challenge. One of the simple things is that right now, Pennsylvania is known as a Keystone State. The Keystone State is because most people from the West that want to go to the East, especially the Northeast, have to go through Pennsylvania. They're getting a free ride. Because now, and I'm speaking again because I was in trucking, that only the large trucking companies are audited and made sure they buy fuel in Pennsylvania, which therefore is paying our taxes. Therefore, how could we intelligently get all the small truckers and all the individuals that are driving to the Northeast through Pennsylvania and not spending a dime but wearing our roads out? Well, I have a simple little system. Again, cost of collection would be almost nothing, if just about, is if there was a surcharge put on all vehicles that were crossing to Delaware. Well, if you're going to go from Pennsylvania to go through Pennsylvania to get to the Northeast, you've got to cross the river, and that means a bridge. Bridge, Arnold tunnels, that put a surcharge on all vehicles. You wouldn't necessarily be taxing heavy Pennsylvanians because they could buy an annual pass, which would be far less expensive, and therefore you would say anybody that's driving through the state, you will pay a toll because we know you're not paying your fair share. Again, it's an efficient, intelligent tax, and we do have a challenge. The fuel tax is 50% of what funds our highways. The fuel tax is projected and has not gone up for years, the revenue produced. We haven't changed the tax. And we know people are going to get more and more fuel efficient, so they're going to be paid less tax. So what are we going to do to replace that? This is why I suggest the Delaware tax program. Again, looking outside the box. How can we make the system work smarter?
And this is similar to a proposal that was bouncing around for a number of years in the General Assembly, and that's the Gateway proposal, trying to obtain funding for transportation through the different gateways into Pennsylvania, and that's one of the best ones that can't be missed.
Well, and again, as I say, that this would primarily tax those who are transiting through the state, and that is what most traffic does. I can speak for trucking that the number of people from the Midwest that are going to New York, going to New England, going to Jersey as comparative, and what even makes it worse is Jersey's fuel tax is 10 cents a gallon or more or less than ours. So obviously, people make it a point: don't buy fuel in Pennsylvania, go to Jersey. The other areas that you would care to talk about is, again, back to our, there's been a very positive action took place in Indiana. It is the first industrial state, the so-called Rust Belt states, that has evoked a right-to-work law.
Yes, now right to work means that you will not have to, there cannot be a closed shop. Employees do not have to join labor unions to work in that
Another way to
particular
put it is
company.
you don't have to pay the unions for the right to work. You can work where you want, and you do not have to pay.
Right to work laws were primarily found in the South, and for a northern state to adopt one is
This is the first.
Is quite interesting.
It's interesting that Pennsylvania, just as Indiana, has a Republican. I believe they may even have a Democratic one of their houses, and I'm not sure, but they were able to pass it. Why is it that Pennsylvania? Also prevailing wage, which, by the way, prevailing wage is a very false statement. It's union wage. That is not the prevailing wage. Since the union is a minority of the workers, it is a non-prevailing wage, we should call the law. But yet all our highways and all public buildings are paying a tremendous penalty because labor is costing somewhere, according to one university, which I had to be involved with, they have all union wage, and they admit it costs them 1/3 more in construction.
33% more
because
expensive
of because basically it's very
wage law.
heavily labor intense, and labor has tremendous benefits, which again, just like our government, because it's out of control because they've got a monopoly. You must use them to build our highways, which is part, again, we need to build more roads, but we need to build them more efficiently. Okay. So overall, the budget, I saw some small items here and there which concern me. It appears that we're cutting back on research. We're cutting back on little areas here, little areas there. The budget is somewhat confusing. Obviously, if you get the whole budget, it's 150 pages long, a lot of items. And that the shifting between departments and moving monies back and forth.
So it's very difficult for the common man to acquire budgetary information, to understand it. And that's why we're so lucky to have you here to go through this with us. We want to come back for your next version of the Arnold Report, and we'll be back in just a minute with that Arnold Report. We'll catch you then.
Behind the Headlines is brought to you as a public service by the Pennsylvania Business Council, envisioning a commonwealth in which residents enjoy a very high quality of life in sustainable communities. The Council works aggressively to define key long-term policy strategies and solutions that make the Commonwealth more competitive, creating and sustaining a better Pennsylvania. Additional underwriting provided by the Worrell Corporation Foundation, based in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, by the Edward H. and Jeannie Arnold Foundation, and by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business. Behind the Headlines is also supported as a public service by Daily Express, transporting construction, farm, and industrial equipment throughout the United States. And by Penn Waste, your best local choice for your waste removal and recycling needs.
Hi, welcome back to the second part of Behind the Headlines. On this show, we're fortunate enough to have Mr. Ed Arnold, who is the president of Susquehanna Valley Center for Public Policy. We've just talked about the state budget and gotten Mr. Arnold's take on the state budget. Now we want to have a new installment of the Arnold Report. Welcome for joining us, Ed. And as you are nice enough to consent to all of our viewers, if they'd like to have answers or information about questions they have about international finance, national finance, personal investments, they can, of course, send that to us and we'll pose those questions to you. We have a few new questions for you this week. And, of course, they all reflect what's going on in the news. One is about, of course, what's going on, what's going on around the country in regard to municipal bonds. Do you think municipal bonds are a good investment at this point for the average person or not?
I think first of all, municipal bonds can be divided into two categories. One is general obligation bonds of a local government, and the other is specifically funded, a la a water or sewer authority or even airport authority, where there's revenues that go directly into it. So even if the government is not necessarily doing well, obviously people are still going to be paying their water bill and their sewer bill and things like this. So my statement would be, I would be very weary of general obligation bonds, because our local governments, whether even state or federal, or excuse me, state or city or other governmental bodies, are in more questionable financial shape. And there could be, obviously, Harrisburg has gotten the most notoriety, but in Pennsylvania, close to 50% of our cities are at least exploring this Section 47 or whatever it is that the state, which is indirectly a quasi-bankruptcy. Now, is it going to affect the bonds? I'm not exactly sure, but I think it's a risk you don't want to take. Mm-hmm. Normally, you buy tax-free bonds for security. So therefore, my statement would be, do not, as a general statement, buy general obligation bonds. Look carefully to see what the funding is, but you may want to consider specific obligation-funded bonds.
Okay. Another viewer writes in that he notes that the stock market is rising again, and he's wondering why the stock market, how that could possibly be happening, and should he be willing to put his faith in equities again?
That is a very, very different. Again, we are in a very, very select world. First of all, the part of the reason the market is rising is because there's just so much cash on the sidelines, and the government, by suppressing artificially our interest rates should be the level of inflation plus a return. Interest rates have now been running and continue to run substantially below the actual level of inflation. In my opinion, the government is fudging the level of inflation, because if you know what you see, they exclude food and energy.
Yes.
The last I know, those are two very important items.
Absolutely.
And there's no real reason to believe that they're going to go down. The good news is natural gas is, but unfortunately that's only one form of energy. And so therefore, that inflation is stronger, and so we're in artificial. But the government's going to, as I said, they will continue to keep interest rates very low. So therefore, they're making it very difficult to be conservative, invest in bonds. Therefore, stocks, again, it back to your tolerance of risk. But if you were to invest in stocks that do have a dividend, which have done reasonably, and these tend to be larger companies, also companies that are more world-oriented. Because you, again, unfortunately, having a more diversified company that is operating throughout the world is far stronger, lower risk, than if you were to invest in a company that is strictly in a regional area.
Well, I think risk was on the minds of our third viewer, who asks about whether silver is as good an investment as gold is. Of course, it's at a lower level, but would silver be as good as investment as gold in your mind?
Well, the thing is, again, you get back to that famous word risk. If you have the tolerance for extreme volatility, there is no question, this is almost a guarantee, gold will go up and down way more aggressively than silver. Silver will go up and down way more aggressively than gold. In the long run, the general consensus is that the ratio of gold to silver is at almost an unprecedented high spread, which means that silver should be, in the long run, the better investment. Mm-hmm. But again, if you want a more conservative ride, obviously gold is more conservative. Mm-hmm. Now, the other thing, though, that is very important to look at is, what would you invest in? And that is, would you invest in stocks of silver or gold? And it's a little more hard for silver, because silver tends to be more of a byproduct of copper and lead, other products. Mm-hmm. Though there are some pure silver plays, but very few. At the same time, there is a risk in gold. Our government did force gold to be turned in the Depression. And I say the last Depression because I think we're very close to one right now. So I would not recommend buying American gold coins. I think if you were going to buy gold coins, you would take currency like the maple leaf in Canada, or the cougaran in South Africa, or even the panda in China, which is a little harder to find. That because our government, they only can take currency back, in theory. At least that's what they did in the past. It is an ironic thing we would look at it that way, but we are in very, very difficult times.
Okay. Well, and the last question in the last 3 minutes that we have related to currency is our last viewer asks whether or not, in light of the events that are transpiring in Europe, will the euro survive? And if it fails, what does that mean for us? What will happen to the dollar?
Well, basically, number one, the good news for Europe is that Germany, which is one of the most efficient economies in the world, is taking aggressive leadership. And therefore, my opinion, and believe me, this is a guess, the euro will survive. At the same time, will Greece survive in the euro? That, I would say, is far more problematic because, unfortunately, again, back to we talked about in Pennsylvania regulations and good government. Mm-hmm. Greece has an extremely challenging culture. They don't seem to believe in paying taxes. They have way too much government as far as employees. Their benefits to their government employees are way disproportionate to the private sector. And obviously when you take something away from people, they get very unhappy, which we've seen in the news. They're very unhappy. Some of the other countries, now there's still been some unhappiness, but they have to go through a new government in Greece, which is going to create a really big question mark.
Yes, there's an election coming
up very soon. Whereas in the case of Spain, which is a very positive thing, which is a lot bigger economy, far more important, they just had an election where they put a government in that said, we are going to tighten things up. We are going to make Spain more competitive. Spain had a very, very bad labor laws. They had wages that were automatically tied to inflation, and therefore they became very non-competitive. They have just passed, which they're having some riots, but nothing like Greece, where they're saying, you, Mr. Employer, come and employ, because we will not, before their regulations were such that it was almost impossible to fire somebody, so people didn't want to hire. So they are trying to change their regulations. They already had their election, so Spain looks like they are moving in the right direction. Italy may also, at this point, they appear to have basically a competent prime minister. And so therefore, again, these are the two large economies in the euro that have been challenged. And Ireland, which has had some challenge, but they are, again, their government has addressed it. One thing that we are not doing right now, so I would argue that the euro will have a lot of gyrations because of Greece, but Greece is really very small. It's psychologically, and how it would happen or exactly the effect, but I think the euro will survive. I think it may even prosper. Very frankly, it may do better than we are because we are not addressing our problems. In most of these countries, they are lowering the cost of public employees, reducing the public employees. In America, we are totally ignoring the problem and just printing money.
Okay. Well, we thank you very much. So you've heard it here. The euro will survive, and time will tell. We'll be waiting to talk about that again on the next Arnold report. Thank you very much for being with us today, Mr. Arnold.
Okay,
and we'll be with you again next week on Behind the Headlines. Be sure to dial in. We'll see you then.